This is Thrive Perspectives, an ever-growing discussion about the issues and ideas that shape our lives, with your guide, Dr. Matthew Jacoby.
Welcome to Thrive Perspectives. I'm Stu, your host, and we're delighted to have you join us for this discussion. What makes worship good? Is it the sound, the songs, the lighting, the silence, the feeling in the room, or the theology underneath it all? Why does one person walk out of a service saying, "That was powerful," while another quietly wonders whether it felt more like a concert than a congregation? And here's the tension. Corporate worship is not a machine that manufactures worship on our behalf. It's a collection of people, each one bringing attention, affection, repentance, faith, fatigue, distraction, desire, and obedience, worshipping together. The gathering can provide an environment that helps us worship, but it cannot worship for us. So what responsibility belongs to the room, the music, the leaders, and the liturgy? And what responsibility still belongs to each one of us? So let's join Matt and Connell in this conversation, not simply asking whether contemporary worship is better than traditional worship, or whether stained glass is holier than an LED wall. What is worship forming in us? When does beauty become a window to God? And when does it become a mirror reflecting our own preferences back to us? Welcome, listeners. Great to have you with us. And today, a topic I think that has been talked about in the church for
2,000 years?
Yes, I was going to say. Exactly, actually. Probably 2,000 years. And
I have to say, a pretty hot topic.
Yeah.
A very hot topic for 2,000 years.
And in fact, we could go back to Jesus and the woman at the well.
We could, yes.
Where it actually kind of, in a sense, begins. And if you haven't figured it out yet, listeners, we're going to be talking about worship, in particular the corporate gathering of worship, because we recognize that worship isn't just music, it isn't just singing songs. Worship is about a lifestyle, the way we live our lives. But we are going to be focusing on the corporate gathering of worship on whatever day that is that you do.
I think it'd be useful just to do a little historical survey.
Let's do that.
Because it really has been a very hot topic for 2,000 years. Going right back to the beginning, we do have a description, of course, in Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 4 of them gathering around the Lord's Supper, around the apostles' teaching and praying together, and fellowship. They're the really four elements that are described, fellowship, the Lord's Supper, preaching and prayer. And we know that prayer took the form of singing as well. In a way, that's a form of us addressing God. So prayer is everything about us addressing God. We also know that we move out of the apostolic era because initially worship was literally around a table. I mean, it was in homes, around a table, and communion was a meal. After a little while, that becomes a little bit more formalized. Communion, Lord's Supper, Eucharist, whatever you want to call it, it's referred to as all those things in different traditions, or the Mass in the Catholic tradition, became a little bit more of a formality and less a sort of organic meal. And so,
can I just say on that though, because there'll be some people going, "Oh yeah," and there's where the problem is. As things get bigger, you have to have more order.
That's right.
It's as simple.
Yeah, and that is a product of things growing and getting bigger.
Yeah.
And so by the time you get to the 2nd century, and we have a document called the Didache, which you can probably get online, which is a very early church document, which addresses, order in worship and things like that. And it becomes evident then that there were actually two parts to the service. A first part of the service that was prayer / singing and the word. And then the communion part, or the celebration of the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper, was seen as a separate part of the service, because what would happen is that those that hadn't been baptized yet, or that were going through training or preparation for baptism, they would go out, do their baptism instruction, and everyone else would share communion. So they had at that stage what we describe as a closed table. That's what we get from that document.
Which was only 50 to 100 years post-Christ.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. It's very early in life.
Yeah, so it's still fairly simple. And those elements, the fellowship, the breaking of bread, prayer, and the apostles' teaching are still, as it says in Acts chapter 2, they're still the key elements. As time goes on, of course, the Christian movement spreads, and of course, in the different areas, you get different variations, and variation, and I'll show my cards right from the start. I don't think variation is a problem. Actually, I think a level of diversity and variation is a good thing, provided you have the key elements. How you do those things, to me, I don't mind the fact that there could be variation.
And the key one of the key elements, I would assume the key element is the why.
Yeah, that's right. Now, I say that because there are traditions, and I mean, both the Catholic and Orthodox tradition insist that no, there is a right way to do it. And churches need to be doing it. They want their churches to be doing it exactly the same way wherever you are, because it's about a continuous, unbroken tradition. But the standardization of worship really didn't come until around 500 with Gregory the Great. He standardized the Catholic liturgy, produced the Catholic Missal that became standard from that time on. The Eastern Orthodox churches, however, were still doing things different. So you get these streams, the Eastern Orthodox churches, and in their different areas, they had their own way of doing things. But there was still a sense that there's a liturgy, it's very scripted, and there's a right way to do things.
Yeah.
And so that kind of becomes the core sort of patterns through the Middle Ages. But what happens gradually through that time is that a lot of the emphasis is placed on the ritual of the Mass, and there's a lot of sort of ritual surrounding that, and that takes the central place. In fact, in church buildings, it literally took central place, because you have a table became an altar, and the Lord's Supper, rather than being a sort of a covenant renewal meal, as I believe it's presented in the New Testament. So again, I'm showing my cards here.
Yep.
It becomes a sacrificial ritual. So the table becomes an altar. And the idea is that the sacrifices of Christ is enacted on the altar every time you celebrate the Mass. And so a lot of the emphasis then is on that, because then you go and you participate in the Mass. And so that becomes the key means of grace of the church.
Right.
And what that means is that there's less emphasis then on preaching. So preaching really diminishes through the Middle Ages. And I think when that happens, I may be biased, but when this happens, I think it can be shown from history that things go awry.
Not so great.
There is, the early church period, that some of the great preachers of the Christian tradition are in the early church period. Augustine, John Chrysostom, these are great preachers. But as time goes on, the clergy are trained to run this ritual, but not necessarily theologically trained. And look, there were attempts at reform, and this was always seen by a problem. The largely, and sometimes even illiterate clergy, certainly biblically illiterate and theologically illiterate, that was recognized as a big problem in the church, and there were attempts at reform here and there. But the imperative really was mostly placed on the Mass and the Lord's Supper. Now, I think for those in contemporary Protestant churches, this is a good perspective to keep in mind, that historical perspective, the amount of emphasis that was put on the Eucharist, Lord's Supper, communion, because it can, in contemporary worship services, be something you sort of race through and
check the box.
In a way, I don't think anyone would say that anyone wants it to be that, but I'm just saying there's a caution there, and this is the value of history, is that you get to see the way that different things were done. Now, of course, during the Reformation, the big emphasis came back on the Word and the centrality of Scripture and preaching the Word, and again, communion was understood not as some kind of almost magical ceremony that imparts salvation to you. It went back to being something like a covenant renewal. And in a sense, what you get with the Reformation is that we're sort of unlocked from the Catholic Missal, and then you get diversity again. And I don't think that's a bad thing, the fact that there was diversity. So, the Lutheran service was actually quite Catholic, and still is to this day, except that there was a big emphasis on preaching, but still a lot of emphasis on the importance of communion and Lord's Supper. So, and it was the same actually in the early Church of England. More emphasis on preaching, but still the emphasis on the Eucharist, and still in both of those traditions quite liturgical. So, very much very scripted. A lot of thought was put into what we think we should do. And also the other thing that was happening at the time, and there's a reaction against this within the Protestant tradition, is that there was still a lot of emphasis on aesthetics. And we're going to talk a bit about aesthetics. And we're going to ask the question, is there an aesthetic dimension to worship? Now, by aesthetics, I mean something that appeals to the senses. So when I walk into a space, there's an appeal to the senses that makes me feel something. Maybe evokes a sense of holiness, a sense of beauty, a sense of the glory of God. And because, of course, right through the Middle Ages, there was an emphasis on aesthetics. And this is particularly the case in the Eastern Orthodox churches, where there was a lot of imagery around the walls. I mean, Eastern Orthodox churches are beautiful, beautiful spaces. And aesthetics is a part of that. You walk into and Orthodox churches, you stand the whole time. It's Orthodox liturgies are at least 2 hours.
Yeah.
They're very long. Again, a lot of emphasis on the Eucharist. But there's a sense that when you walk into the building, everything around you evokes the sorts of things that you should be feeling. Reverence, a sense of holiness, a sense of communion with saints present and past. And so all of the imagery around you on the walls is imagery of past saints and scenes from Gospels. And it's like a whole hierarchy. It's like a heavenly hierarchy. Surrounded by a cloud of witnesses, as the book of Hebrews puts it. And that communicated something, it was a tool for teaching, because through the Middle Ages, most people were not literate. And so it was the imagery that, that taught them. But also there was a sense in which, in Eastern Orthodox iconography, a sense that to pay homage to an image, the image is a kind of intermediary in a way. It's like the image carries something of the reality in a sense. And by honoring an image of Christ, you are through that honoring Christ himself. So they wouldn't say it's idolatry because you're not worshipping the image, but through the image, you're worshipping Christ. And I think there were waves of controversies through the Middle Ages. They're known as the iconoclastic controversies. And it was, smashing the images, get rid of the images, and now they're back. Because the question of idolatry kept coming up. And it came up partly because, it's one thing to have a theology and to justify images, but then how are ordinary people actually using them?
Yeah. Yes.
That's what the problematic part is. This is why I think there's lots of different ways of doing things and lots of variation between different ways of worship and so on. And that's been the case right through history. But I guess it went through a period where, as you say, it was standardized through the Catholic Church for quite a long period.
The various Orthodox churches have their standardized forms as well.
And so it kind of locks you into one way of doing it. When you sort of bring variation into it, variation challenges each other. So where things kind of go off the rails. So you mentioned like the iconography.
Yeah.
The principle behind it isn't necessarily bad. Imagery and so on can produce a reaction within you that can lead you to feel something, which is often the accusation that's made against, say, contemporary worship, which we can talk about a bit later. But that's often the accusations made against that because it's all just feeling and we don't want to be feeling.
But you're creating an atmosphere that's evoking feelings.
Which is exactly what that is.
And we could well ask, but what's wrong with that? Because that's always been a part of Christian worship. That's the aesthetic dimension.
But even in the most liturgical, traditional sense, that's what all of that was there to do. Yeah. But then us being people, we kind of tend to corrupt it and we end up turning those icons. We accidentally start worshipping the icons or which we see.
We can wreck anything. Yeah, we can take any good idea or any good thing and wreck it.
Can I change the word from can to will?
But I think when there's variation, the fact that there's other ways of doing things can then challenge us to recognize
that is the beauty of that is I think the beauty of diversity.
And I also think with diversity there are different movements of time periods. Where God seems to either move in a different way or cultural shifts that means that maybe we need to place the emphasis back on another aspect. So there's no one kind of worship pattern that embodies the best way to worship should be. They're all just sort of representations of elements of it. So when you have variation, it's almost like it swings and roundabouts. It can go from one form to another, and there is no one kind of, if you just do it this way, you've achieved perfection. Actually, perfection is more achieved by doing it this way and then swinging to another way. the embodiment of the difference and the variation and the change is what actually kind of keeps us on track.
Yeah, and having a view of those changes and being able to understand why different traditions do things the way that they do is a great way for any church to reflect on what they're doing.
Yeah.
It's enormously valuable, and even the lessons from history are really valuable. Let me give you another example. Just talked about the iconoclast controversies and the toing and froing around aesthetics, right? Around imagery. Because, of course, imagery can become idolatry, can become dependent on the aesthetic dimension as well. That doesn't necessarily discount that. There is a movement. I'm going to talk about the Calvinist and Puritan movement in a moment, which did largely get rid of all the aesthetics. But there was an interesting movement in the 1300s in Notre Dame Cathedral. There was a new sort of music emerged that was basically went from the very simple form of singing. So I'm going to talk about music now. The standardized form of singing was traced back to Gregory the Great, and therefore is known as Gregorian. So we know it as Gregorian charts. Now you can jump on your phone and whatever streaming service and put Gregorian charts, and you'll hear something that's very simple. It's a group of voices singing essentially the same melody. What happens is that they start to use harmony. Now, we think this is kind of fine, but it became what we call polyphonic. So these amazing interwoven harmonies, and it becomes much more elaborate. And so if you want to do a search on that, early polyphonic, you could look up Periton, Leonin. Maybe some of the flowering of polyphonic music is Thomas Tallis, William Byrd, Thomas Louis Vittoria, Palestrina, names like that. Great composers that compose these amazing polyphonic, beautiful, interwoven, heavenly, absolutely divine singing. Yeah. Now, when I play this music, it's sublime. It's sublimely beautiful music. It doesn't have instruments. At this stage, instruments were not used in worship. Worship has not had instruments right through this period. There was some use of a sort of basic organ because it sounded like a voice, and it was a instrument that you could use to lead choirs or voices. Yep. Now, in the early church, instruments were associated with Greek pagan festivals. And so to keep a distinction, they were only ever singing unaccompanied.
Yep.
Now, when I say singing unaccompanied, the whole service was sung in the early church. So
Scripture, everything.
Yeah, everything. So there's a complaint. Augustine, if I'm remembering this rightly, writes a letter to an area where someone is just reading the Scriptures, and that's seen as you're meant to intone the Scriptures,
right,
in a sort of almost sung, chanted sort of sense, because it shows reverence for the text, and so again, this is something that's like, wow, okay, that was a big issue back then.
Yeah,
you don't just read Scripture; you intone it, you sing it. I like that. I think we should sing Scripture more often, but I'm biased.
But it could be you that has to do it too, mind you.
Yeah. So basically, Gregorian style singing was always unaccompanied. There, as I said, there was some use of a sort of organ to help with that. But when you have this flowering of this polyphonic, they started using harmony. This is enormously controversial.
Wow.
It was seen as lavish. It's too lavish. It's just, Pete, there was a lot of debate. I mean, we talk about the worship wars. This is, in the early church, maybe there was controversy about whether you read or sing the Scriptures. But the worship wars in the High Middle Ages, in the 1300s, were about whether you sing plain song. Yeah. Plain song is unaccompanied singing, but without any harmonies. That's plain song, or whether you go polyphonic, and that was the worship wars. There were worship wars over that. Now, eventually, polyphonic wins out, and it becomes an absolute sensation, and it coincides with notation. With music was passed on.
By memory.
Yeah, by memory. So you have notation. So this spreads throughout. You get this amazing sort of flowering of music. Interestingly, instruments don't really come in until still quite a while. Luther was all for instruments. He was a musician, and he believed, let's pull out all the stops. This is like...
This is an organ term.
This is... All beauty is God's beauty in his, and music is this divine gift. So let's pull out all the stops and use it. And when I say pull out all the stops, it's imagery from the organ, of course. Yes. And it's in the Lutheran tradition, actually, is a great music tradition. And some of the greatest composers, including Bach, Johann Sebastian Bach, of course, he was working in the Lutheran church. So the Lutheran tradition becomes a very rich musical tradition. You also get beautiful musical traditions in the Catholic Church. The Orthodox churches, however, they're still using plain song at this time.
They're Orthodox.
Yeah, although there was a movement to go more polyphonic, but in Orthodox worship, strictly unaccompanied singing. That's the way that it works. I mean, there's beautiful traditions of choral singing in the Orthodox churches, but the Protestant movement that really looks at all of this and reacts against the complexity of the liturgy, with, as they would cynically put it, all the bells and the smells. There is a movement in the Reformation, and it's associated with Ulrich Zwingli in Switzerland, John Calvin in Geneva, mainly John Calvin in Geneva, but then you get it in Britain. It becomes known as the Puritan movement. And the reason it's referred to as Puritan in England is because they insisted on purity of worship, right? The purity of worship was the key for them. So they wanted to get rid of anything that wasn't explicitly advocated by the New Testament, basically. Right. And that's known as the regulative principle. So the regulative principle, and this comes from Calvin, the regulative principle is we don't do anything that isn't specifically endorsed in the New Testament.
So what is endorsed in the New Testament?
Well, they went back to Acts, the fellowship, the breaking of bread, prayer, and the apostles' teaching. And singing, they believed, should be unaccompanied because they believed that instruments were associated with the temple. So it was unaccompanied singing, it was prayer, very long sermons. So, and look, in Protestant churches, again, preaching takes, and still to this day has a very important place. But that's so very, very simple. So they got rid of all, whitewashed walls, plain windows, anything that could be a distraction. So no stained glass windows. There would be a simple order of service, but the idea is let's not make this a show. Let's strip it back to the most simple elements, because essentially that's what they had done theologically. Because remember, Catholic theology had all these accretions, that is, all of these things added to it, complex system of saints and other beliefs that they'd sort of added over the centuries, and the church felt it had the authority to do that. But what the reformers are doing is saying, no, it's sola scriptura. We only believe what is consistent with the Bible. Okay, so it's getting back to the simple biblical faith. So that was a theological movement. We're getting back to simple biblical faith, simple apostolic doctrine and theology, and that was applied to worship as well. And look, there's something, I think there's something great about that as well. And this is the thing, like that idea of stripping things back to its simple elements, because the whole thing was just getting out of hand. The thing about that is that it becomes much more easily transferable. A lot of the early missionary churches were this simple form, simple theology and simple practice makes it transferable across cultures. And so I think it's got something going for it.
Well, like the New Testament, it's not like prescribing that. It was just a model of how that they did it. It didn't say
that's right. So that's the regulative principle. So again, the question there is
therefore that's what you should do.
Yeah, what do we think of the regulative
were doing
principle? Now, I think it's too restricted because we're not given a rule book in the New Testament. I don't think it's meant to be a rule book for worship. I mean,
well, the fact there is no rule, there is no prescribed rule that says you must do it this way. It wasn't.
There's descriptions, not prescriptions.
But what was important was the principle of stripping back to what was necessary to achieve what? Yeah. What is it we're trying to achieve here? What is worship? And what are we trying to achieve? And I think when we lose sight of that and try to achieve a whole lot of other things under the banner of worship, we start complicating it. So the principle of the New Testament, what does it sort of say to us today is we have to keep referring to that. Is what we're doing helping or hindering, enabling people to be able to worship?
Yeah.
I think just being able to ask that question, constantly going, is this helping or is it hindering? Irrespective of the style, because I think,
but what can help one person might hinder another, and we're getting into the application end.
But isn't that the point of difference? Because I've spent time sort of in the traditional liturgical church and spent time in the modern contemporary worship. My personal experience in the traditional is that people are turning up and going through the motion. Like, we've got to say this, we've got to do this. This is the process we go through.
It does become very repetitive and slightly mindless.
Yeah. So that process in itself.
It doesn't have to be, but that's a danger of it.
But when you do it like that, week after week after week, this is the model, this is the pattern. We've got to start with this, we've got to read this, we've got to say that, we've got to repeat this, we've got to, and so on. Then that becomes an established pattern. And us being people, we tend to corrupt that and end up turning it into, okay, I've been through, I've ticked the boxes, that's Sunday done, let's get out of here and get on with it. It's kind of like, that's it. That's my spiritual dues paid for the week, and off we go. But then we come to more of the contemporary style of worship with contemporary music and so on. Then we become complacent because we lose the sense of, well, it's just like the music's the same as outside of the church, or it feels the same in church. We lose the sense of the sacredness of walking into a sanctuary or a sacred space. And so we end up treating it less than what it is. Coming into worship becomes just feels a bit less. And again, I think that comes from familiarity as well.
Yeah, the form. I think whatever we do, there are issues. So maybe we'll lay out the issues.
Well, the issues. I think the issue's not the form. I think that would be important to say. The issue, I don't think, is the form. It's the fruit the form produces. Essentially, it's what is it doing.
Yeah.
Because I think there will be people who are quite happy to sit in a silent room, and that is a great way for them to worship. But there are other people where it'll just feel completely empty, and what am I doing? And I can't even think straight in here, and that doesn't serve them to actually connect and sense.
And hence why difference is important.
Yeah.
But I also think as someone who's in contemporary church, that's where I prefer to be personally. Like in our church, we have Good Friday service, which is a more liturgical focus. And I think that is my favourite service for the whole year.
But it wouldn't be if we did that every Sunday.
Every week.
No.
I wouldn't say, wow, that was fantastic. Let's do that every week. Because then what would happen is I would just turn it into the pattern. Yep, that's what happens. And it just becomes that. And it's that difference that going to that liturgical, more traditional setting really makes the benefit of that stand out, and the contrast. And you can see that does something that we can't do in a less liturgical, more contemporary service. But there's things we can do in a more contemporary service that we can't do in a liturgical sense, So there's pros and cons. And I kind of think it's when we close ourselves off and say, no, this is the right way, or it should be this way.
Okay, so let's talk about that. Let's take on some of the issues.
Yep.
And I think the first issue is there a right way? I think that's worthwhile talking about, because in the Catholic Church, a local Catholic parish priest doesn't have the freedom to change the liturgy. The liturgy is the liturgy, and it's absolutely imperative. Same with a local Orthodox parish priest. You can't change the liturgy. It's a sacred cow in that sense. And it's somewhat the same in Puritan traditions. You can allow variation, and liturgical, even strict liturgical traditions, there's still variation. It allows for certain variations in those traditions. And it's the same in some ways within Puritan-style churches. And I know we're probably not familiar with this. They still are around, but they're so simple in a sense. They would say there is a right way. There definitely is a right way, and it's to do these things. And in fact, the Puritan churches, even around to this today, and this goes back to the early Puritan movement, by the way, this is another thing I should mention, they only ever sang psalms because that's the biblical songbook, because they're following the regular principle, and we're just singing psalms. And they even interpret where Paul says sing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. They just see that as three categories of psalms, essentially. Now, I think that's a very difficult argument to make. But the point is, actually, for a lot of church history in the Protestant tradition, most of what was sung was psalms, pretty much up till, I would say, up to the 20th century. Up to that late, most of what people were singing in church was psalms. In the 1800s, hymns became equal, and in fact, a lot of songbooks had psalms and hymns. So there are still Puritan churches that around today, though, that still just sing psalms. Now, they would say singing psalms, praying, preaching the word, and sharing the sacrament, that's the right way to do things.
Yeah.
There is a right way, and just doing those things and no more than that is the key.
Hymns are controversial. Hymns are a controversy in that environment.
Hymns are controversial in that.
Can I just come back to a couple of points? Because I think it's perhaps part of this is understanding how the church has grown, because you made the comment that the Catholic Church, for instance, is very prescriptive in what the prayer book is, essentially what the liturgy is. But is there an element where, to make sure there isn't drift when you've suddenly got not just 30 people meeting in a room, got to print something so we're consistent across everything that we're doing? It's actually guarding something rather than just being a problem. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
because
that's a good point.
There's an organizational aspect.
When you're a very large, institution, with churches all over the place. And this was Gregory's issue. He wanted to standardize worship because it was all going in different directions, and maybe there's lots of dodgy stuff that was happening.
Yes.
So he wrote a liturgy. It's not just a liturgy. There's different liturgies because they followed a liturgical calendar as well. There were different liturgies for different days, a lot of, overlap, but that was about standardizing it.
Yeah. And the point is, exactly, that's not the sacred bit of it. It's just a form that makes it easy to keep everyone on track, in a sense.
And in a sense, Puritan churches or Puritan-influenced churches had the same thing, essentially, but that was by limiting what they did.
Yes.
That was so we're just going to do these simple things. Now, I would argue that essentially larger evangelical churches, I'm going to refer to your standard sort of contemporary worship church, are very influenced. And I know this is hard because there's lots of aesthetic, and we'll talk about the aesthetic aspects.
Yeah, great.
It's basically, what we've basically done is that we've gone with the Puritan principle of we'll only do these things, but we've added a whole lot of aesthetic stuff to that, you know what I mean? So if you go, and I've been to a lot, and Stu, you've been with me, to lots of big evangelical churches all around the world, and I would say the liturgy is exactly the same. You sing your few songs at the start, you have your announcements, you have a sermon, you might, and communion might be before the message or after the message. That's pretty much the standard. And you're even singing a lot of, I can go to America and I know the songs that they're singing. So it's even, and that's in other denominations even. So there is a remarkable sort of standardization. And I think that's kind of growing out of that. We've simplified things down to the core elements of what we want to do when we come together. I commend that. I think that's a really good idea. But then we've added a whole lot of aesthetic elements to that. Like I would say, is there a right way to do things? My suggestion would be there are certainly essential elements. And I think the essential elements are described in Acts chapter 2. Yeah. They gathered together, fellowship, breaking of bread, prayer, and the apostles' teaching. Those 4 things. And prayer / because remember, the prayers were invariably sung. And so I think those are the core elements. I think having those things is essential. Now, there's a question around how often do you do the Lord's Supper? Now, a lot of Puritan churches were doing the Lord's Supper once a year because they wanted to make a really big, it was over the Easter season. It was, and they would, you'd have preparation and it was a very big event where you would share the Lord's Supper and you'd commemorate this very much covenantal, had a very strong covenantal focus. So we're reconfirming our covenant together with God. And it's this big yearly event. Of course, in Catholic and Orthodox churches, it happens every week. And some evangelical churches of Christ in Australia are like that.
Every week,
Yeah, have that every week. Elsewhere, I think it's a matter of discretion, really.
I think the danger, we need to talk about this, and I think we still should talk about aesthetics and stuff, but I think, like you said, the things that we do are the things we should do, but the doing isn't the thing. It's the why we do that is the thing. And I think that's where we get drawn off into, because coming and singing and just following words or whatever, if it's not about your heart posture and what God's doing in you as a result of whatever that experience might be, and if that's consistently the pattern for most of the people in the room, then we're just going through a list of
But isn't how
chores.
we do it also what kind of practices help us do that?
Correct. And so the question we need to be asking is, what are we trying to achieve? What should we be achieving through our act of corporate worship? And are we achieving that? Because I'm really mindful, again, as I said at the start, of Jesus saying, there'll come a time where people won't worship here, there, or in a certain way. They'll just worship in spirit and in truth.
In spirit and in truth.
Yes.
I think that's,
I think that is important. Totally.
And so what are we trying to achieve? A good way to put that in a way that is often put when corporate worship is discussed theologically is it's like a family conversation. We address God and God addresses us. So we address God through prayer, singing, and God addresses us through his word and his sacrament. And the sacrament is a bit of both. We are recommitting ourselves and God is speaking to us through the sacrament. So it's this conversational experience that the corporate worship environment is creating. And it unites us. It's meant to have this unifying effect.
Yeah.
I mean, it's essential.
Vertical worship isn't just vertical; it's also horizontal. I totally agree.
Yeah, that's right. So it's the family gathering, and this is, I think, a good way to see it. God is not just about saving individuals; He's about building a family, and gathering to worship God together and have this family gathering, this two-way family conversation, is actually the core of the Christian movement. I think the regular gatherings, and the writer of Hebrews says, do not forsake the assembly, of God's people. If God's people are gathering, you should be there. That should be a priority, right? And in fact, in the early church, people paid very dearly. It was actually gathering that drew a lot of persecution.
Yeah.
Because the Romans were fine if you just did things on your own. You went to a local temple, whatever, choose your own God and go to the temple and pay your dues. But as soon as people started gathering together under a cause that was bigger than the empire, that looked like insurrection or something like that. So there was a great risk to gathering, but they still did it, right? Because they saw that gathering was absolutely essential. So anyone that says, I don't need to go to a church service to be a Christian, you're completely on a different page to what the Christian movement is about, because that family gathering is absolutely essential. Whether you like it or not is beside the point. It's essentially a demonstration of your faith. Just turning up and being there is a demonstration of your faith. It's got nothing to do with whether you like it or not. If we're going to a demonstration of some cause in the streets of Melbourne or whatever, and before City Hall, and you're not thinking, okay, before I go, I'll check out who's playing, who's speaking.
That's right.
Yeah. No. You just go because you want to stand up for that cause. That's what we do when we gather together. That's the why. It's addressing God. It's the family gathering. It's the family conversation. I think we need to be careful thinking that everything that a church should do has to happen in that moment.
No.
Yeah. Church life is bigger than just the church service, but a church service, as we call it, or our corporate weekly gatherings are crucial to that.
And they model something, I think, a bit like the Lord's Prayer. That wasn't the only prayer we should ever pray, but it was a model prayer that Jesus said, use this in a sense. Pray that prayer, but also use this as a model prayer. And so worship can demonstrate to us collectively what we should really be doing in our own.
And that Lord's Prayer too, I mean, when I think about it with the Lord's Supper, that's an argument that emphasizes, I think, why either the aesthetics important or having ways to do things is important. Because if you look at the Lord's Supper, you've got the wine and the bread. So obviously for that, it was helpful for Jesus to give this to his followers. These are symbols. You need to do this because it's important, because through those symbols, you understand what I'm doing for you by focusing on those.
Well, it's very aesthetic. It's a physical thing.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
That conveys something. Now, the Puritan argument would be we stick to the two sacraments, baptism and the Lord's Supper, and we don't go beyond that. Yeah. Because once you start adding other things, that they would say that's problematic. And perhaps the next question we can move on to here is to talk about the aesthetic.
Because why would you not use the aesthetics? If God's given us music, God's given us all these things and our emotions and
we're aesthetic creatures. Okay, so
why would we not use them?
That's right. That's who we are. We're aesthetic creatures, and the biblical faith is an emotional heart faith. To quote Jonathan Edwards, it's about religious affections, right? Very famous 18th century theologian Jonathan Edwards from America, very instrumental in the Great Awakening in America, wrote a very famous book called The Religious Affections, where he says true religion, in his words, consists in large part in the formation of right religious affections. That's his point, right? Love for God. And so, music is to rouse the affections. Even, Calvin believed that tunes should be rousing, right? They should lift the heart, right? That's aesthetics, okay? So it's difficult then to draw a line and say, you can sing songs, but you can't have musical instruments. Because even if you look at the Bible, instruments were seen as an extension of the expression of praise. It's like I can use language, but when I use an instrument beside what I'm saying, it amplifies the affection that I'm expressing, right? So the constant reference to praise the Lord with musical instruments in the Psalms, to me, is enough to say that
there's value.
There is value, at the very least, not only value, but that we actually should use aesthetic medium to extend our forms of expression. Now, the question is, what aesthetic medium do we use? And okay, once you get to aesthetics, you're in the realm of culture. You're in the realm of cultural form. So I've worshipped in a church in Africa, and I can tell you their singing is completely different to our singing. I think it's way better, actually. But I don't think that would work here in this culture. They all sing and dance, by the way, too. Like at least in the church that I went, like was singing and dancing together. So the reason we use the music that we use is because we are using the cultural idiom, the aesthetic cultural idiom of our culture. You know, we don't use an organ because it's not really the most familiar aesthetic idiom that people are used to.
Still a valid thing, and we can trace that, I think.
Yeah. I mean, and some people would say, no, but when you go into church, it should be different. Yes, the question is, in what ways should we be different, and in what ways should we be the same?
Yeah.
So we should speak, and a good example of what should be the same is that we should always speak the language of the culture that we're in. There was a period, and there are some Catholics that still argue this, that we should speak a different language in our services.
Well, the Orthodox, of course.
Orthodox as well. If you go to a Greek that's
sorry.
If you go to a Greek Orthodox church, it's in Greek. In Russian, it's in Russian.
I think it's relevancy, which some people would say to be relevant, we have to make it look like the culture. But I don't think it needs to look like the culture. It can look different, but relevance means being able to still communicate and speak to the culture.
A better word, I think, would be contextual.
Because I do think...
Yeah, because relevance is a big term, but this is about speaking the heart language of the culture. So that the reason why missionaries, when they went to other countries, they learned the language, they translated them, but still Bible translation is a massive thing.
But they also learned the traditions, so the things you do and don't do. And
exactly. They learned the traditions. Yep. I mean, there were problems, I think, when they tried to impose like a European cultural idiom into that. It always worked better when the people spoke their own language and used their own cultural idiom. And I think there's a connection between those two things, because cultural forms are a kind of language. When I express my feelings, I use these words and I use this sort of singing or this kind of cultural form, right? Therefore, contextualization of worship is important. It needs to be in the heart language and in the heart forms of the people. Now, of course, in a culture like ours, some like classical music, some like contemporary music, some like metal, some like hip hop, some like, you're never really going to please everyone. And most churches, what most contemporary churches do is they probably lean towards the younger element because it's about
next generation.
It's all about the next generation. I think there's something sound about that. Churches that tend to lean on the older generation, what the older generation wants, which can be a lot connected to nostalgia. And this is what evokes all the great experiences I've had in the past. And that can create a bit of drag, a bit of cultural drag. So I do think it's sound to lean in the direction of the contemporary. I think that's about using the idiom of your culture.
Well, there's the term that's out there at the moment people talking about is the attractional church model. So
yeah, that's a different topic,
and I think
completely different topic. Yeah, attractional versus
it's relevant as far as like how do we remain relevant? The view, I think, over a lot of the contemporary church has tried attractional.
It's not about attraction. So just because you're relevant, just because you're using the cultural idiom, it doesn't mean you're an attractional church. Attractional churches, that was a lot about creating an event that people from outside are going to want to go to. So so our church, for example, I wouldn't say we're an attractional church, but what we do want is we want to be relevant to our culture, to use the word that you used before. We want to be contextualized. We want people to walk in, and there's a element of difference. And the element of difference is huge, by the way. People are praying and singing to God, and the message is completely different. And the lifestyles, hopefully, the lifestyles of people are completely. That's the holiness principle. That's where the difference should be. I don't think cultural forms should be different. I think when people walk into the building, there should be a sense that there's an intelligibility to the way that we speak and the cultural forms that we use. Intelligibility. We're using the sort of heart language and the heart idiom of the people that we're trying to reach. I'm not sure if that's not so much attractional as just relevant.
Well, I kind of was thinking about it, and I was kind of looking at myself when we sort of look back, say, to the 60s, where sort of everybody went to church. It was just kind of like normal sort of thing. And church was, everyone got dressed up and put their hats on and suits, and there was fairly traditional kind of services. And then society's shifted. You sort of get into the period, where kind of get your hippie kind of era, and people are becoming more freer, like exploring their own individuality and moving into that sort of phase. And then there's a sort of rejection of organized, established religion. And the church at that time sort of ceased to be relevant to a lot of that sort of generation. And so then it actually...
So that's the relevance issue, because a lot of the young people, they had different music forms. And during the revivals, the Jesus Revolution, as they call it, in the late 60s and early 70s. All of these people were coming into churches and they were bringing their music with them, right? So, it wasn't organ music anymore. They were playing guitars and drums, and that's actually what spurned the famous worship wars. I mean, that when we talk about worship wars, the worship wars are famous for the sort of 70s and 80s. And even when I became a Christian, I was sort of first doing church stuff in the early 90s. And even then, the worship wars were still happening. So this was going on for a while. And the controversy was, a lot of churches were that standard kind of traditional, maybe an organ and a piano, and you'd sing hymns. And there were some variations and whatever, but the big controversy was singing chorus and having a band with drums and guitars and bass guitar. And that was enormously controversial. Now, really what was happening, there was a change in the culture. Yeah. And the church needed to reflect the cultural idiom.
The people.
Yeah. And honestly, the discussions around, because it was seen like drums and electric guitars was seen as like this almost like satanic kind of, straight out of the pubs, and that we're just bringing this stuff into the church. But no, it's a musical idiom. It's like a language, and it was seen as being this terribly profane thing. Now, the interesting thing is the same argument that was used in the objections against, for example, Martin Luther translating the Bible into German. It's like, that's a profane language, Latin, it says this sacred text needs to be in a sacred language in Latin, but no, we need to speak the language of the people. That's the point of translating into languages, including, languages that of small people group. A lot of effort goes into Bible translation. And I think it's the same principle. That was basically what was happening during the worship wars. It's like, we need to be relevant to our culture. Yeah. We need to be using the idiom of our culture and the aesthetic medium that is intelligible to our culture.
But then we can take that, and then sort of where I think it goes off the rails is we try to do everything to really try to draw people to us. And I think this is where people really get turned off with a lot of contemporary worship, the large-scale productions, the big entertainment focus. And so where does that start?
And that's what I associate with the attractional model. So the attractional model is you bring people along, and we're going to create this spectacular event, and we're going to create an atmosphere. It's not that all of that is a problem, and this is where it's not a clear-cut thing, because there is a place for creating an atmosphere, creating a feeling. That's fine. Aesthetics are fine.
But most people who would be critical of that would say the big old cathedrals. Well, you think of the millions of dollars spent on building cathedrals. It took hundreds of years to build with stained glass windows, and it was all to create a sense of hugeness. And so is modern day production simply our way of creating a cathedral? And I would say I don't think the large scale production in itself is the problem. The problem is, what's the purpose of that large scale production and what's the fruit of that large scale production? Because I think we can sometimes just chuck everything, lights and hazes and everything. It's all a problem. No, it's actually how we're using that and what we're seeing is the outcome of that. What's the fruit of that? Just quickly, the other thing I would say is relevance isn't popularity. I think a lot of people think when we say we need to be relevant and intelligible, that means we have to just conform to the... No, that's not what we're saying at all. Yeah. And I think that's an important distinction here. We're not necessarily going to be popular, but we do need to be relevant. Jesus wasn't popular, but he was still relevant. He was speaking using stories and principles that they would understand to communicate something different.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think, what we've talked about here is there's not one right way to do it, but there are essential elements. I think the forms can vary. I've been to some churches that are very, very simple, that sort of Puritan principle. I've been to big churches that have massive bands, been to a church that had an orchestra, massive sets for the sermon, like actual sets, to illustrate things. I've been to more traditional kind of choral churches. I think we've really got to avoid saying that's right and that's wrong. And if you're in one kind of church, I recommend not pointing at the church that's different to yours and criticizing it. there are different forms. I think those differences are good. I think what we were saying before, they challenge each other. I think it's good, actually, to look at Anglican or the Catholic liturgy and say, are there elements here that we've missed out? I personally think there are. I think elements of confession of sin. Where has that gone? Like corporate confession of sin. I've often talked about the element of lament in worship and being sad together. There are elements that are in traditional liturgies that we have lost, and we need to look over the fence respectfully at the others in our wider Christian family and respectfully learn and understand why they're doing the things that they're doing.
For me, and it's probably true for all of us, we go into some of these places and suddenly the fact that they have an orchestra and a big stage, we're not actually looking at what's being said and what they're using it. We just build our own barrier internally and we shut down, actually, because we've made our opinion about whether that's the right way to worship or not.
Yeah, we might say it's too lavish. But see, that's the argument.
And then that shuts us down from even hearing if God does want to speak to us through that. You know?
Yeah,
so,
I mean, is there a too lavish? I mean, this is the argument from the move from plain song to polyphonic, all the controversy around that. When does the band get too big? I mean, you look at, the singers, and there were hundreds of singers and instrumentalists in the temple. Talk about a big band. I think what you're saying, Stu, is the right. It's about why we're doing what we're doing and what is the fruit of it. And the fact is, in the churches that I've been to that are like that, that's got lots of people serving. Like, lots of people are pouring in, putting a lot of passion. It involves a lot of people. You've got carpenters involved building the sets and loving it. It's like
it's their way of using their skill.
That's right, to bless the church, and you've got musicians and whatever.
So I think it's not what it is, it's how we're using it. I think that's the point. Let me just, comment that I just want to sum up with, and then we probably need to close this out. In terms of aesthetics, because I feel like that's a big part of what concerns many people in terms of the worship war argument is, I think that the most important thing a church needs to be aware of is the aesthetic is a window, not a mirror. We don't want to just have people reflecting what's out in the world. We want it to be a window to God, to the Lord. We want them to go in and feel the majesty, the awe, the reverence, whatever it is that we're trying to imbibe. We want that to be what they see, not just a mirror of what they want, a consumerist kind of, this is what I want, and so that's what I should get. But we want it to be a window.
But I think where most people push back on the aesthetics, I think where people are concerned is it just a feeling? Just evokes a feeling. If the music's played a certain way or certain way that things are spoken or the vibe.
Yeah, but it could be. That depends on the person.
Exactly. Whose responsibility is that?
But I can be moved, but it can be just the music moving me.
So just because you have something that appeals to emotion, and preaching, I think, should appeal to people's hearts and emotion, but that doesn't mean you're just appealing. It's part of the picture, not wholly the picture. So I like the window picture because you're using these forms to help people access and see into something. I think, to continue to sum up where we've got to, that there are essential elements, I think, and I would set the fellowship, the prayer, the preaching, and the sacraments. They're the essential, and gathering around those things. That's what makes us the church. And when I say prayer, it's prayer, song. I think those are such important elements, and that just always need to be a central part of what we do when we come together. I think coming together is crucial. We've said that. I think there is a place for the aesthetic dimension. I think we should allow for that, and we should be sensitive to the issue of cultural idiom. Are we doing that in a way that's culturally intelligible for people? Is this the best way? Because we're communicating something and we're encouraging people to communicate something. If we see it as a conversation, worship as a family conversation with God, well, God speaks to us in our language and as an extension of that in our cultural idiom. And we address God in the most natural cultural idiom and in our language. And so the aesthetic media that we use, I think, needs to be a level of cultural consistency to it that makes sense. I would add to that, I also appreciate an approach to aesthetics that evokes our past as well. I'd probably throw that in there. I'm increasingly attracted to the idea of helping people to see that we didn't just turn up in the last 10 years. We're a contemporary church but we didn't start yesterday. We have a 2,000-year-old tradition. And so elements of tradition, this is why I still think hymns have a place in our worship, because there's a connection with the past. They're artistic production from the past. We have some stained glass windows up the back of our auditorium. I love the fact that evokes a sense of traditional connection with our past and these sorts of things. So I think aesthetic media can do that as well. So we are called to gather together. Probably a parting piece of advice, because worship involves these forms, these cultural forms and these aesthetic media, it's never going to fully appeal to everyone. There are forms of music that I would prefer more than other forms of music, and a church is never going to be able to please everyone. In fact, partly the beauty of different churches with different ways of doing things is that don't necessarily think we should go to a church just because it appeals to our aesthetic sensibilities. But that could be part of it. I think that's okay for that to be part of it. But try not to make it all about what you want and what you think. Like, it's like what appeals to you. What I think you've got to ask yourself is this a place I can serve? Is this a place I can bring people? And is this a place that I can be involved in worshiping God and hearing from God and serving, bringing my friends along? I think that's a core question. And I think we're on the right track if we ask ourselves that.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Thrive Perspectives. Our hope is that these discussions will challenge you to look at life from a new perspective. You'll find all our resources at the Thrive Today website, thrivetoday.tv. If there's a topic that you'd like us to discuss, please email us. Our email is contact@thrivetoday.tv. Until next time, our prayer is that you will thrive.